Tonight, we journey to a place where the divine speaks not in thunder but in whispers, where the most profound truths are found not in the earthquake's roar, but in the gentle breath of silence that follows. Close your eyes and let yourself drift back over 3,000 years to the rugged hills of ancient Israel, where a weary prophet named Elijah learned that God's voice comes not as we might expect, but as we most need to hear it. The air is warm and dry, carrying the scent of wild herbs and ancient stones. In the distance, you can hear the soft bleating of goats and the whisper of wind through olive groves. This is a land where the sacred and the ordinary meet, where burning bushes once spoke and seas parted at a word. But tonight's story is quieter than those grand miracles. It's about a moment when the creator of the universe chose to speak in the gentlest of voices, teaching us that sometimes the most powerful messages come wrapped in stillness. So settle into your pillow, let your breathing slow and deepen, and prepare to discover how a man at the end of his rope found hope in the most unexpected place, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between breaths, in the still small voice that speaks when all the noise finally fades away. This is Elijah's story. This is your invitation to listen. In the rolling hills of Gilead, where the morning mist clings to ancient olive trees, and the air carries the sweet scent of wild honey, a man named Elijah first heard the voice that would change everything. Picture yourself walking these timeless paths, your feet touching the same stones where prophets once tread, feeling the warmth of the eastern sun as it paints the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Elijah was a man of the wilderness, born among the rugged cliffs and hidden springs of Tishbe. His hands were calloused from years of simple work, his skin weathered by wind and sun. There was nothing particularly remarkable about his appearance, nothing that would make strangers turn their heads or whisper his name in the marketplace. He was, in many ways, like the shepherds and farmers who populated this ancient land, a man whose daily rhythm followed the eternal dance of sunrise and sunset. But within this ordinary man burned something extraordinary. A fire that had been kindled not by human ambition, but by the gentle breath of the Almighty. When God's call came to Elijah, it didn't arrive with fanfare or ceremony. Instead, it settled into his heart like morning dew, quiet but undeniable, transforming everything it touched. The land of Israel in those days was caught between two worlds, two ways of seeing the divine. King Ahab ruled from his ivory palace in Samaria, his crown glittering with the wealth of trade routes and tribute. But it was his queen, Jezebel, daughter of the king of Sidon, who truly shaped the spiritual landscape of the nation. She brought with her the worship of Baal, the storm god, the deity of rain and fertility that her people had served for generations. Imagine the temples that began to rise throughout Israel, their altars stained with the blood of sacrifice, their groves filled with the intoxicating rituals of a religion that promised prosperity through appeasement. The sound of drums and cymbals echoed from these high places, mixing with the cries of devotees who believed that louder worship meant greater blessing. It was a faith of frenzy, of working oneself into ecstasy to capture the attention of distant gods. But in the quiet corners of the land, in hidden valleys and forgotten caves, the worship of the true God continued. These faithful ones remembered the stories their grandparents had whispered, tales of a God who spoke not in the chaos of ritual, but in the intimacy of relationship. They remembered Abraham's conversations under starlit skies, Moses' encounters in the desert silence, David's songs that rose like incense from a shepherd's heart. Elijah found himself caught between these two worlds, watching as his people slowly forgot the voice that had called them out of Egypt, the presence that had led them through the wilderness with pillars of cloud and fire. He saw how the prosperity that Baal worship promised seemed to flourish in the short term. The rains came, the crops grew, the economy thrived. It was easy to believe that these new gods were powerful, that the old ways were simply outdated traditions. But Elijah knew something that the king and queen had forgotten. He understood that the rains that fell and the harvests that bloomed were not the gifts of stone idols or wooden images. They came from the hand of the one who had spoken the world into existence, who numbered every star and knew the name of every sparrow that fell. When the word of the Lord came to Elijah, instructing him to go before King Ahab with a message that would shake the foundations of the kingdom, the prophet didn't hesitate. There was a certainty in his spirit, a peace that transcended understanding. He knew that he was not walking alone into the presence of earthly power. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was with him, and that presence was more real than any throne or crown. The message he carried was simple but devastating. As surely as the Lord God of Israel lived, there would be no dew or rain in the coming years except by his word. It was a direct challenge to Baal, a quiet declaration that the true source of life's blessings was about to reveal himself through absence rather than abundance. Picture Elijah standing before the king in that opulent throne room, surrounded by the glittering symbols of worldly power. The prophet's simple robes must have seemed almost peasant-like among the silk and gold that adorned the court. But there was something in his bearing, something in the quiet authority of his words, that made even kings take notice. Ahab listened to this strange pronouncement with growing unease. Here was a man claiming to speak for a god that the kingdom was slowly forgetting, declaring that the rains would cease until further notice. It seemed almost laughable, this rustic prophet challenging the established order with nothing but words. But as Elijah spoke, something shifted in the spiritual atmosphere of the land. The drought, he proclaimed, was not merely a weather pattern, but a divine pause, a merciful interruption designed to help a wayward people remember where their true help came from. In the stillness that would follow, in the silence of cloudless skies, God would prepare both prophet and people for a conversation that would echo through eternity. The stage was set for a confrontation between the noise of false worship and the quiet authority of truth, between the frenzy of human effort and the peace of divine trust. 3 years had passed since Elijah's words sealed the heavens, and the land lay parched beneath an unrelenting sun. The brooks had dried to dust, the wells had failed, and even the morning dew no longer kissed the withered grass. It was in this season of desperate thirst that God whispered to his prophet once more, calling him to return from his hiding place by the brook Cherith to face a king and a people ready for answers. Mount Carmel rises like a gentle giant from the coastal plain, its slopes once green with oak and pine, now brown and brittle from the long drought. Picture yourself climbing this ancient mountain in the cool of early morning, feeling the crunch of dried leaves beneath your feet, breathing air so clear and thin it seems to carry whispers from eternity itself. This was the stage God chose for a conversation between heaven and earth, a place where the finite would meet the infinite in terms so simple a child could understand. Elijah's challenge to King Ahab was elegantly direct. Gather all Israel to Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal who eat at Jezebel's table. Let us settle this question once and for all. Who is the true God? Who controls the rain? Who holds the power of life and death in gentle hands? As the great crowd gathered on the mountain's broad summit, you can almost feel the anticipation hanging in the air like morning mist. Here were people who had watched their children's eyes grow hollow from hunger, who had seen their livestock die for want of water, who had prayed to every god they could name and received only silence in return. They came with questions burning in their hearts like fever, desperate for someone, anyone, to prove that the divine still cared about human suffering. The prophets of Baal arrived in their hundreds, resplendent in ceremonial robes, carrying the instruments of their frenzied worship. These were men who had dedicated their lives to serving the storm god, who knew every ritual, every chant, every sacred dance that might compel their deity to action. They moved with the confidence of those who believed that spiritual power came through effort, through the sheer force of human will and determination. Elijah stood alone before this multitude, a solitary figure whose simple garment of camel's hair seemed almost shabby beside the ornate vestments of Baal's servants. But there was something in his stillness, something in the quiet way he surveyed the crowd that spoke of a different kind of authority. This was not the authority of position or learning, but the deeper confidence of one who had learned to listen for the voice that speaks in whispers. The rules of the contest were beautifully simple. 2 altars would be built, 2 sacrifices prepared. Each side would call upon their god to send fire from heaven to consume the offering. The God who answered by fire would be proven true, and the people would know whom to serve. Watch as the prophets of Baal begin their ritual. See how they arrange their sacrifice with meticulous care. every detail perfect according to ancient custom. Then listen as their voices rise in unison, calling upon their God with words that have been repeated for generations. O Baal, hear us. O Baal, answer us. The chanting grows louder, more desperate, echoing across the mountain like the cry of wounded birds. Hours pass under the merciless sun. The prophets dance around their altar with increasing frenzy, their movements becoming wild, uncontrolled. They leap upon the altar itself, crying out with voices growing hoarse from the effort. But the sky remains empty, the sacrifice untouched, the silence absolute. It is the silence of gods who cannot hear because they have no ears, who cannot answer because they have no voice. By midday, when the sun beats down with crushing intensity, Elijah begins to speak, but his words are not curses or condemnation. Instead, there is almost a gentleness in his mockery, the patience of a teacher helping slow students understand a difficult lesson. Cry aloud, he suggests with quiet irony. For surely he is a god. Perhaps he is meditating, or perhaps he has gone on a journey, or perhaps he is sleeping and must be awakened. The prophets respond with even greater desperation, cutting themselves with knives and lances until their blood flows freely, mingling with the dust of the mountain. Their cries become screams, their worship becomes self-destruction, yet still the heavens remain sealed, still their God remains silent. It is a heartbreaking display of human effort trying to bridge a gap that effort alone can never cross. As evening approaches and the fruitless ritual finally exhausts itself, Elijah steps forward with the calm assurance of one who has already heard the answer to his prayer. Watch as he repairs the altar of the Lord that had been broken down, taking 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. See how he digs a trench around the altar, arranges the wood with careful precision, prepares the sacrifice according to ancient instruction. Then comes the moment that reveals the nature of true faith. Elijah calls for water, precious water in this time of drought, and has it poured over the sacrifice until everything is soaked, until the trench around the altar runs full. It seems like madness, this waste of life's most precious resource, yet it speaks of a confidence so complete that even the impossible becomes possible. When Elijah finally prays, his words are neither frenzied nor desperate. They flow like a quiet stream, intimate and conversational, the words of a son speaking to a loving father. Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. The fire falls like liquid lightning, consuming not only the sacrifice and the wood, but the stones of the altar and even the water in the trench. In that blazing moment, the question is answered not with words but with overwhelming presence, not with argument but with glory so pure it leaves no room for doubt. As the fire of God faded from the altar and the last echoes of the fallen nation's cries drifted across Mount Carmel, something profound settled into the evening air. The question that had burned in Israel's heart for 3 long years had been answered with such clarity that even the hardest skeptic could no longer doubt. The people had fallen on their faces, their voices joining in a chorus that seemed to rise from the very stones beneath their feet. The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. But Elijah knew that this moment of recognition, beautiful as it was, represented only half of God's promise. The fire had proven divine authority, but the people's deepest need remained unmet. The land still lay parched and broken, the wells still ran dry, and hungry children still waited for the blessing that only heaven could provide. The prophet's heart turned now toward that second miracle, the one that would bring life back to a dying earth. Picture Elijah as he climbs higher up Mount Carmel's slope, leaving behind the crowd and the still warm stones of the altar. His steps are measured, unhurried, carrying the quiet confidence of one who has just witnessed the impossible and knows it was only the beginning. The mountain's peak offers a clear view westward, where the Mediterranean Sea stretches toward the horizon like a sheet of hammered copper in the fading light. Here, in this place of solitude, Elijah does something that speaks to the heart of true prayer. He doesn't stand with arms raised dramatically toward heaven, doesn't cry out with the frenzied desperation that had marked the prophets of Baal. Instead, he bows low, so low that his face touches the earth, his knees drawn up to his chest in a posture of complete humility and trust. This is prayer as intimate conversation, prayer as the natural breathing of a soul that has learned to rest in divine love. Elijah's words, if he speaks any at all, are whispers carried away by the gentle evening breeze. But his heart speaks volumes, pouring out gratitude for the victory just witnessed and quietly, confidently asking for the rain that has been withheld for so long. 7 times the prophet sends his servant to look toward the sea. 7 times the young man returns with the same report. There is nothing, nothing but the endless expanse of empty sky meeting empty water. But Elijah doesn't grow discouraged or impatient. He simply returns to his posture of prayer, his spirit settled in that deep peace that comes from knowing you're aligned with heaven's purposes. On the 7th look, when the servant climbs to the very highest point and shades his eyes against the setting sun, something changes. There, rising from the western horizon like a whispered promise, appears a cloud no bigger than a man's hand. It seems almost insignificant against the vast canvas of sky. This tiny wisp of vapour that could be dismissed as wishful thinking by anyone who didn't understand the language of divine beginnings. But Elijah hears in this small sign the sound of abundance, the quiet announcement that heaven's storehouse is about to open. He sends his servant running to King Ahab with urgent instructions. Prepare your chariot and go down from the mountain, lest the rain stop you. It's a message that speaks of certainty where human logic sees only possibility, of trust that transforms whispers into shouts of preparation. Watch as that tiny cloud begins to grow, spreading across the western sky like spilled ink on parchment. What started as something small enough to cup in human hands becomes a towering wall of vapour, dark with the promise of rain. The wind begins to stir. At first, just a gentle breeze that rustles the dried grass, then stronger gusts that bend the stunted trees and send dust devils dancing across the mountain's face. The sky, which has remained pitilessly clear for over 3 years, suddenly comes alive with movement and sound. Clouds race in from the sea, piling up against each other like great ships in a celestial harbour. The air itself seems to thicken with moisture, carrying the sweet scent of rain while the first drops begin to fall, fat and warm and precious beyond measure. King Ahab, understanding at last the urgency of Elijah's message, hastily prepares his royal chariot for the journey down to his winter palace in Jezreel. The horses stamp and snort, sensing the change in the atmosphere, their hooves striking sparks from the stone as they begin their descent. It should be an easy journey for the king's swift chariot, pulled by the finest horses in Israel, racing ahead of the coming storm. But something extraordinary happens as the rain begins in earnest. The hand of the Lord comes upon Elijah, filling him with supernatural strength and speed. The prophet, this man of prayer and solitude, suddenly finds himself running alongside and then ahead of the royal chariot, his feet seeming barely to touch the ground as he flies down the mountain path. Picture this scene, the king of Israel in his magnificent chariot, drawn by powerful horses, racing through the growing downpour, only to be overtaken by a man on foot whose simple robe streams behind him like a banner. It's an image of divine power working through human vessels, of heaven's strength made perfect in earthly weakness. The rain that began as gentle drops becomes a torrent, then a deluge that transforms the landscape in minutes. Streams that have been dry for 3 years suddenly roar to life, carrying away the accumulated dust and debris of the long drought. The earth drinks deeply, gratefully, steam rising from the ground as cool water meets sun-baked soil. As Elijah reaches the gates of Jezreel ahead of the king's chariot, his heart must have soared with the completion of God's promise. The fire had proven divine authority. The rain had restored divine blessing. Israel had witnessed both judgment and mercy, both power and provision. Victory seemed complete. The mission accomplished. The people restored to their true God. The prophet stands in the downpour, his face lifted to receive the blessing of water from heaven, feeling the cool drops wash away the dust of years. Around him, the whole earth seems to sing with joy, every plant and tree and blade of grass receiving life after the long season of death. It is a moment of triumph, of rest, of deep satisfaction in work well done. The rain fell through the night like liquid silver, drumming against the palace walls of Jezreel with the rhythm of restoration. In the royal chambers, King Ahab recounted to his queen the extraordinary events that had unfolded on Mount Carmel. His voice carried a mixture of awe and uncertainty as he described the fire that fell from heaven, the people's unanimous cry of recognition, and the rain that followed at Elijah's simple prayer. But as Ahab spoke, something dark settled into the opulent room where Queen Jezebel held court. Picture her there, reclining among silk cushions and golden ornaments brought from her homeland of Sidon, her eyes growing cold as winter stars as she absorbed each detail of her defeat. This was a woman who had never learned to bend, whose will had been forged in the furnaces of absolute power and unyielding pride. Jezebel was no ordinary queen. She was the daughter of Baal, king of the Sidonians, raised from birth to believe that gods could be controlled, manipulated, bargained with through the right rituals and sacrifices. Her entire worldview rested on the foundation that divine power flowed through human intermediaries, through priests and prophets who could be bought, intimidated, or eliminated when they became inconvenient. Now her husband sat before her, describing events that shattered that carefully constructed reality. 450 of her prophets, men she had fed from her own table, trained in her own temples, supported with the wealth of her kingdom, had been proven powerless before a single Hebrew speaking to his invisible God. The shame of it burned in her chest like acid, the public humiliation that would echo through every court in the ancient world. Listen as she processes this news in the flickering light of oil lamps, her mind already calculating, already planning. The rain outside might seem like vindication for Elijah, but Jezebel understood something that the celebrating people had forgotten. Miracles may prove divine power, but earthly power still belonged to those who wielded the sword, who controlled the armies, who could reach into any corner of the kingdom with lethal intent. As dawn breaks over the still wet landscape, Jezebel calls for a messenger. Her voice, when she speaks, carries the cold precision of someone accustomed to having her words obeyed without question. The message she sends to Elijah is brief but devastating in its clarity. So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. It's an oath sworn in the presence of her defeated gods, a public declaration that she will not let this insult stand. Within 24 hours, the prophet who had humiliated her religion and destroyed her spiritual authority would join his victims in death. She speaks these words with the casual confidence of someone who has never failed to make good on such promises. The messenger finds Elijah in the early morning light, perhaps still marveling at the transformation that the rain has brought to the landscape. Wildflowers are already beginning to push through the softened earth, and the air carries the sweet fragrance of a world reborn. The prophet's heart might have been full of gratitude, his spirit still resting in the profound peace that comes after witnessing God's faithfulness so dramatically demonstrated. But when the messenger delivers Jezebel's oath, something unexpected happens in Elijah's heart. This man who had stood fearlessly before King Ahab, who had challenged 450 prophets without flinching, who had called down fire from heaven with the quiet confidence of intimate prayer, suddenly finds himself gripped by a fear so powerful it drowns out every other voice in his spirit. It's a peculiar thing, this timing of terror. Yesterday, Elijah had been David facing Goliath, armed with nothing but faith and seeing victory fall from heaven like lightning. Today, faced with the threat of one angry woman, he becomes like a child waking from a nightmare, forgetting every promise, every miracle, every whispered assurance that had carried him through impossible circumstances. Perhaps it's the very magnitude of yesterday's victory that makes today's threat seem so overwhelming. The human heart, it seems, can only sustain the heights of triumph for so long before it begins to crave the familiar territory of ordinary concerns. After touching heaven, the soul sometimes finds earth more frightening than it was before. Elijah had expended everything in the confrontation on Mount Carmel, pouring out his faith like water until the vessel of his spirit ran dry. In the aftermath of such intensity, the simplest challenges can seem insurmountable. It's the strange vulnerability that follows great spiritual victories, when the warrior discovers that his armor feels suddenly too heavy to bear. There's something deeply human in this moment, something that speaks to anyone who has ever achieved a dream only to wake the next morning feeling empty rather than fulfilled. Elijah had seen God's power displayed in ways that would be remembered for generations. Yet now he finds himself unable to apply that same trust to his immediate circumstances. The queen's threat works its way into his mind like poison, conjuring images of royal guards hunting through the hills, of professional killers tracking him with the patient skill of those who serve absolute power. Jezebel had resources Elijah couldn't match, reach he couldn't escape, determination he couldn't outlast. Where yesterday he had felt wrapped in divine protection, today he feels exposed, vulnerable, utterly alone. Fear has a way of rewriting history in the present tense. The miracles of Mount Carmel begin to feel distant, like stories someone else told about someone else's God. The fire from heaven becomes a memory rather than a reality. The answered prayer for rain transforms into mere coincidence examined under the harsh light of survival instinct. As the sun climbs higher in the sky and the hours tick toward Jezebel's deadline, Elijah finds himself facing a choice that will define the next chapter of his journey. Will he stand on the foundation of yesterday's miracles, or will he run toward an uncertain horizon, carrying nothing but his fear and his suddenly fragile humanity? The prophet who had outrun the king's chariot in supernatural strength now prepares to run again, but this time not in victory's wake, but in terror's shadow, not toward a destination, but away from a threat that seems larger than any promise he has ever received. Fear, when it truly takes hold of the human heart, moves with a speed that defies all reason. One moment Elijah stands in the morning light, still breathing the sweet air of yesterday's triumph, and the next he is gathering his simple possessions with hands that tremble like autumn leaves. The messenger's words echo in his mind with the persistence of a funeral drum. By this time tomorrow, you will be dead. Watch as the prophet begins his flight, moving with the desperate urgency of prey that has caught the scent of the hunter. His feet, which just yesterday had carried him ahead of the king's chariot in supernatural strength, now stumble with the clumsy haste of panic. Every shadow seems to conceal a soldier. Every distant sound might herald the approach of Jezebel's assassins. The journey south from Jezreel takes him through landscapes that should have comforted his heart. Here are the rolling hills where his ancestors had walked, where Abraham had built altars and Jacob had dreamed of ladders reaching into heaven. These are the very paths where Moses had led the children of Israel toward their promised inheritance, where David had hidden from Saul's jealous rage. But fear has a way of transforming even sacred ground into alien territory. Elijah travels with his faithful servant, a young man who has shared the prophet's simple life, who has witnessed the miracles and heard the intimate prayers that called down fire and rain. Picture this companion trying to keep pace with his master's frantic steps, perhaps offering words of comfort or reminders of God's recent faithfulness, only to find that fear has made Elijah temporarily deaf to anything but the voice of his own terror. For days they journey southward, sleeping little, eating less, driven by the relentless conviction that safety lies somewhere ahead, always just beyond the next ridge or around the next bend. The landscape gradually changes as they flee, the green hills of the north giving way to the more austere beauty of the southern wilderness. The air grows drier, the vegetation sparser, the distances between water sources longer and more uncertain. When they finally reach Beersheba, that ancient city that marks the southernmost boundary of the Promised Land, Elijah makes a decision that reveals the depth of his isolation. Here, where his people's history began with Abraham's covenant and Isaac's wells, the prophet does something that speaks to his profound sense of aloneness. He leaves his servant behind. Perhaps he tells the young man that the journey ahead is too dangerous, that there's no point in both of them dying in the wilderness. Maybe he speaks of practical concerns, of the need for someone to return home and tell the story if the worst should happen. But beneath these rational explanations lies a deeper truth. Elijah has reached that place where the soul believes it must face its darkness alone. There's something profoundly moving about this moment of separation. The servant who has shared the prophet's ministry, who has climbed Mount Carmel and witnessed the fire from heaven, who has run through the rain that broke 3 years of drought, must now watch his master disappear into the wilderness with nothing but a waterskin and the weight of his own despair. Beyond Beersheba stretches the wilderness of the Negev, a vast expanse of rolling hills and ancient wadis, where the only sounds are the whisper of wind through acacia thorns and the distant cry of desert birds. This is landscape stripped to its essence, where life clings to existence with quiet desperation, and every step forward requires a conscious choice to continue. Elijah walks into this harsh beauty carrying more than physical exhaustion. Each footstep seems to echo with the rhythm of questions that have no easy answers. How could the God who sent fire from heaven allow his prophet to flee like a common criminal? How could the one who controlled the rains let his servant stumble through the wilderness with a waterskin that grows lighter with each passing hour? The desert has always been a place of revelation, but it's also a place of stripping away, where everything non-essential falls away like old skin, leaving only the raw truth of what lies beneath. Here, in this place where miracles seem as distant as the stars, Elijah discovers something that perhaps he had forgotten in the glory of Mount Carmel. He is human. The man who had stood before kings and challenged the prophets of false gods finds himself stumbling over stones that a child could navigate. The prophet who had called down fire with casual confidence now struggles to remember the simple prayers his mother taught him as a boy. The servant of the Most High who had outrun royal chariots now moves with the shuffling gait of someone who has forgotten how to hope. Physical exhaustion becomes a mirror for spiritual desolation. As his body grows weaker with each passing mile, his soul seems to shrink within him, contracting like a flower closing against the desert wind. The water that should sustain him tastes like dust. The meagre food he carries sits like stones in his stomach. And sleep, when it finally comes, brings dreams filled with the sound of pursuing footsteps. Yet there's something beautiful even in this desperate flight, something that speaks to the mysterious ways that divine love works through human weakness. In running from Jezebel's threat, Elijah is actually running toward an encounter that will redefine everything he thought he knew about the voice of God. In his panic, he's moving toward the very place where heaven's whisper will prove more powerful than earth's thunder. The wilderness that seems to swallow him like a grave is actually a womb, preparing him for a rebirth he cannot yet imagine. Each stumbling step carries him closer to a mountain where the universe will grow quiet enough for him to hear the sound that changes everything. The still, small voice that speaks when all other voices finally fall silent. But for now, there is only the endless walking, the growing weakness, the persistent fear, and the gradual realization that even heroes sometimes discover they are simply human beings in need of grace. A day's journey into the wilderness, where the last traces of human habitation disappear behind rolling hills of sand and stone, Elijah finally stops, not because he has reached his destination, for he has no destination now, but because his body simply refuses to carry him any further. Here, in a landscape so barren it seems forgotten by time itself, stands a solitary broom tree, its sparse branches offering the only shade for miles in any direction. The broom tree is a humble shrub. Nothing grand or impressive. Just a scraggly desert dweller that has learned to survive on almost nothing. Its leaves are small and sparse, its shade minimal. Yet in this place of absolute desolation, it represents the only mercy the landscape has to offer. Picture Elijah as he stumbles toward this meagre shelter, his water skin empty, his strength spent, his hope as withered as the drought-stricken land he left behind. He collapses beneath the tree's thin shadow, like a man surrendering to an inevitable tide. The sand beneath him is still warm from the day's heat, and the silence that surrounds him is so complete, it seems to have weight and substance. This is not the peaceful quiet of a library or chapel, but the profound stillness of a place where life hangs by the thinnest of threads, where every breath becomes a conscious choice to continue. Here, in this place of ultimate isolation, Elijah does something that prophets are not supposed to do. He prays for death. But this is not the dramatic gesture of someone seeking attention or trying to manipulate heaven's response. This is the raw, honest cry of a soul that has simply reached the end of its ability to endure. "It is enough," he whispers to the empty sky. "Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers." Listen to the profound honesty in these words. There's no pretense here, no attempt to maintain the image of the mighty prophet who calls down fire from heaven. Elijah has stripped away every layer of spiritual performance and revealed the human heart beneath, fragile and finite and desperately tired. He admits what every servant of God eventually discovers, that he is not superhuman, not invincible, not somehow exempt from the limitations that define mortal existence. The phrase, "I am not better than my fathers," carries the weight of generational disappointment. Elijah has seen the same cycle of spiritual awakening and apostasy that plagued Israel throughout its history. Abraham had walked with God, yet his descendants turned to idols. Moses had delivered the people from Egypt, yet they worshipped a golden calf before the mountain stopped smoking. David had been a man after God's own heart, yet even his kingdom had been divided by sin and rebellion. Now Elijah, who had hoped to be the prophet who finally turned Israel's heart permanently toward their true God, lies beneath a desert shrub, acknowledging that he too has failed. The fire from heaven had brought temporary recognition, but not lasting transformation. The rain had ended the drought, but not the deeper spiritual famine that plagued the nation. He had given everything he had to give, and it had not been enough. The desert around him seems to echo this sense of ending. This is a place where things come to die, where the harsh realities of existence strip away everything non-essential, leaving only the most basic questions of survival. The sun beats down mercilessly, the wind carries the grit of ancient stones, and the silence stretches on and on like the space between heartbeats. Yet even in this place of apparent death, something sacred is happening. The desert has always been God's classroom, the place where heaven's most important lessons are taught. Abraham heard his call in the wilderness between Ur and Canaan. Moses encountered the burning bush in the solitude of Midian's wastes. Jacob wrestled with the angel in a lonely place beside the Jabbok. Now Elijah joins this ancient fellowship of those who have met the divine in the empty places. As the desert twilight settles around him like a gentle blanket, exhaustion finally claims the prophet. Sleep comes not as escape, but as gift. The first kindness his body has known in days of desperate flight. His breathing slows and deepens. His clenched fists gradually relax, and the tension that has held him rigid with fear begins to ebb away like water soaking into thirsty ground. There's something beautiful about sleep in such circumstances, something that speaks to the fundamental mercy woven into the fabric of creation. Even in our darkest moments, when despair seems absolute and hope feels like a mockery, the body's need for rest provides a natural pause, a divinely ordained intermission in the drama of human suffering. Under the vast canopy of desert stars, Elijah sleeps the deep sleep of the utterly spent. The same God who had answered his prayers with fire and rain now ministers to him through unconsciousness. allowing his overwrought nervous system to find the peace that his conscious mind cannot access. His dreams, if they come, are probably formless and grey, the mind's way of processing exhaustion too deep for ordinary thought. The broom tree stands sentinel over this broken prophet, its sparse branches swaying gently in the night breeze, offering what protection it can to a man who has learned that even God's servants sometimes reach the end of their rope. Above them both, the ancient stars wheel in their courses, the same lights that had shone on Abraham and Moses and David, bearing witness to another chapter in the long story of divine love pursuing human hearts through the wilderness of their doubt. In this place where death seems more likely than deliverance, where human effort has finally exhausted itself completely, the stage is being set for an encounter with grace that will redefine everything. But for now, there is only sleep, merciful and healing sleep, the first gift heaven offers to souls that have finally stopped trying to save themselves. In the deep silence of the desert night, where sleep had finally claimed the broken prophet, something shifts in the invisible realm, not with fanfare or blazing light, but with the gentle presence of one sent to minister to the weary. The angel approaches Elijah's resting place beneath the broom tree with movements soft as morning mist, carrying the tender care of heaven for a child who has cried himself to sleep. The touch, when it comes, is perhaps the gentlest thing Elijah has felt in months, not the harsh grip of fear that has driven him across the wilderness, not the desperate clinging of his own hands to stone and shrub as he stumbled southward, but something infinitely kind, a hand that rests upon his shoulder with the warmth of compassion, awakening him not to danger but to provision. "Arise and eat," comes the voice, soft as wind through desert grass, carrying no urgency or demand, only invitation. These are not the words of a master commanding a servant, but of a caregiver attending to someone beloved who has forgotten how to care for himself. The angel speaks as a mother might to a child recovering from fever, or as a friend might to a companion who has walked too far and grown too weary to remember the way home. Elijah opens his eyes slowly, perhaps expecting to find himself still trapped in the nightmare of his flight, but instead of the harsh reality of pursuit and panic, he discovers something that seems too wonderful to be real. Beside his makeshift bed beneath the broom tree, as if placed there by invisible hands, lies fresh bread still warm from heaven's oven, and a cruse of water so cool and clear it seems to hold all the sweetness of mountain springs. The bread is not the coarse, gritty fare of desert travellers, mixed with sand and baked over dung fires. This is bread as bread was meant to be, soft and nourishing, carrying the fragrance of wheat fields kissed by morning dew. Each bite seems to restore not just his body but something deeper, some essential part of his spirit that had been slowly starving through the long months of conflict and crisis. The water, too, is more than mere liquid. It flows into his parched mouth like liquid mercy, washing away the bitter taste of fear and despair that has coated his tongue for days. As he drinks, he can almost feel life returning to cells that had forgotten what it meant to be truly nourished. Vitality flowing back into a frame that had been slowly consuming itself in the fire of its own anxiety. There's something profoundly moving about this simple meal in the wilderness. God, who had recently demonstrated his power through fire that consumed stone and rain that ended drought, now reveals his character through bread and water offered to a single, suffering servant. The same hands that hold galaxies in their grasp bend down to prepare breakfast for a frightened man beneath a desert shrub. As Elijah eats and drinks, the angel waits with infinite patience, neither rushing him nor overwhelming him with explanations or expectations. There are no demands for immediate recovery, no lectures about faith or courage, no reminders of duties left undone, just the quiet presence of love made practical through the most basic needs of human existence. When the prophet has finished his meal, sleep comes again, natural and healing. This second rest is different from the exhausted collapse that had claimed him before. Now his body sleeps not from defeat, but from the deep relaxation that comes when safety is assured and provision is certain. The bread and water work their quiet miracle in his system, rebuilding strength that panic had depleted, restoring hope that despair had drained away. The angel remains nearby as Elijah sleeps again, a guardian presence watching over the restoration that happens in the deep places of the soul when conscious worry finally releases its grip. This is not the sleep of escape, but of healing. Not the unconsciousness of defeat, but the rest that prepares for journeys yet unknown. When the angelic touch comes a second time, it carries the same gentleness as before, the same absence of urgency or condemnation. "Arise and eat," the voice repeats, "because the journey is too great for you." These words hold layers of meaning that Elijah cannot yet fully comprehend. There is a journey ahead, one that will require more strength than he currently possesses, more endurance than his depleted reserves can provide. The second meal waits beside him, identical to the first in its simple perfection. Fresh bread, cool water, offered without conditions or explanations. God's provision doesn't diminish with repetition. It flows as consistently as sunrise, as reliable as the rotation of seasons. The angel understands something about human frailty that perhaps Elijah has forgotten in his prophetic calling, that recovery is not instant, that restoration requires time and repeated acts of grace. As the prophet eats his second heaven-sent meal, something begins to stir within him that he had thought permanently extinguished. Not yet hope, perhaps, but the absence of despair. Not yet strength, but the promise of strength to come. The bread tastes like possibility, the water like the first drops of rain after a long drought of the soul. The angel's ministry is complete, though Elijah may not yet realize it. No sermons have been preached, no visions granted, no dramatic interventions performed. Instead, heaven has touched earth through the most fundamental acts of compassion, a gentle awakening, nourishing food, patient presence, and the gift of restorative sleep. In this quiet encounter beneath the broom tree, God reveals something essential about his character. He is not only the God of fire and earthquake and rushing wind, but also the God of whispered comfort, of bread offered to the hungry, of water provided for the thirsty. He meets his children not only in the heights of spiritual ecstasy, but also in the depths of human need, not only in moments of triumph, but especially in seasons of defeat. The journey that lies ahead will test every reserve of strength that these meals provide, will require every ounce of endurance that this rest restores. But for now, there is only the simple miracle of being cared for, the profound gift of divine tenderness extended to a servant who had forgotten that he was also, and always, a beloved son, strengthened by the angel's provision. Elijah rises from beneath the broom tree with legs that no longer shake, with eyes that no longer dart fearfully toward every horizon. The bread and water have done more than restore his physical strength. They have awakened something deep within his spirit, a quiet certainty that his journey is not yet finished, that the God who sent angels to feed him has more chapters to write in this story of redemption. He turns his face southward, toward the wilderness of Sinai, though he may not yet fully understand why his steps bend in that direction. Something older than conscious thought draws him toward the mountain where heaven first touched earth in thunder and flame, where Moses received the tablets of stone, where the children of Israel learned what it meant to encounter the living God. It is as if the desert itself whispers the way, as if the ancient paths remember the footsteps of prophets and call out to their kinsmen across the centuries. The journey to Horeb stretches across 40 days and 40 nights, that sacred number that appears throughout Scripture like a divine signature. 40 days of rain in Noah's time, 40 years of wandering for Israel in this same wilderness, 40 days that Moses spent on the mountain receiving the law, 40 days that would later mark another's preparation for ministry in these timeless wastes. There is something about this span of time that transforms more than heals, that prepares more than sustains, that opens the soul to depths of understanding that ordinary seasons cannot reach. But this is no ordinary journey, sustained by no ordinary provisions. The strength that flows through Elijah's body as he walks comes not from multiple meals or carefully rationed water, but from that single heaven-sent feast beneath the broom tree. Each morning he wakes with energy renewed. Each evening he rests with vigour undiminished. It is as if the angel's bread has become a living source within him, nourishing him from the inside out with sustenance that defies every natural law. Picture him as he walks, his pace steady and unhurried, no longer driven by the frantic urgency of flight, but drawn by something deeper, something that pulls at his heart like the memory of a half-forgotten song. His feet find their rhythm on paths carved by wind and water across countless ages, following routes that caravans and pilgrims have traced since the world was young. The desert around him is vast and varied, sometimes rolling hills of sand that shift like sleeping giants, sometimes rocky escarpments that rise like natural cathedrals toward the endless sky. The solitude is profound, but no longer oppressive. Where once the silence had seemed to mock his prayers and echo his failures, now it begins to feel like preparation, like the clearing of inner space for something too important to be hurried. Each day's walking becomes a form of meditation. Each night's rest beneath the wheeling stars, a lesson in trust. He learns again the ancient rhythm of human life lived in harmony with creation's cycles, rising with the sun, walking in its light, resting when darkness falls. As the days pass and the miles accumulate beneath his feet, the landscape gradually changes, becoming more austere, more dramatically sculpted by the patient artistry of wind and rain. The rocks take on strange and wonderful shapes, carved by centuries into formations that seem almost alive, almost purposeful. This is the wilderness where God's people learned to depend on manna from heaven, where they discovered that human beings do not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Almighty. Elijah walks in the footsteps of Moses, following paths that his great predecessor had traced 8 centuries before. Sometimes, in the early morning light or the gentle glow of evening, he can almost sense the presence of that ancient journey, can almost hear the echo of 1,000,000 Hebrew voices raised in complaint or praise as they struggled to learn what it meant to be the people of God. The very stones seem to remember their passage. The wadis and valleys hold the memory of their camps. There's something healing about joining this great procession of pilgrims, about becoming part of a story larger than his own immediate troubles. The fears that had driven him from Jezreel begin to seem smaller against the backdrop of such vast purpose, such eternal significance. He is not just a frightened prophet fleeing an angry queen. He is a servant of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, walking toward the same mountain where heaven had revealed its character to generations before him. The nights bring their own gifts of restoration. Lying beneath stars that shine with ancient light, he finds his prayers returning slowly, tentatively, like birds coming back to a tree after a storm has passed. Not yet the bold intercessions that had called down fire and rain, but simpler words, quieter conversations, the gradual rebuilding of intimacy that fear had fractured. Day by day, the mountain grows larger on the horizon, its peaks becoming more distinct against the desert sky. Mount Horeb, called Sinai by some, the mountain of God, the place where divine glory had descended in cloud and fire while the earth trembled beneath the weight of divine presence. This is the destination toward which his feet have been carrying him, though he still doesn't fully understand why. As the 40th day dawns and the final stage of his journey begins, Elijah can feel something stirring in the spiritual atmosphere around him, a sense of approaching encounter that makes his pulse quicken, not with fear, but with anticipation. The mountain looms ahead, ancient and patient, holding its secrets like a wise grandfather waiting to speak with a troubled grandchild. He has walked 400 miles, sustained by a single meal, crossed the wilderness on strength that is not his own, followed paths that lead not away from his calling, but deeper into its mystery. The prophet, who had collapsed beneath a broom tree in despair, now approaches the mountain of God with steps that grow more certain with each passing hour. Ahead lies the place where earth and heaven meet, where questions find their answers not in explanations, but in presence, where the still small voice waits to speak truths that can only be heard in the profound silence of surrendered hearts. Mount Horeb rises from the desert floor like a monument to eternity itself, its weathered slopes bearing the marks of countless storms and seasons, its peaks crowned with the memory of divine encounter. As Elijah approaches its base after 40 days of walking, his footsteps slow with the weight of approaching something sacred, something that has witnessed conversations between heaven and earth that changed the course of human history. The mountain's face is scarred with caves and crevices, each one carved by wind and water over millennia of patient erosion. Some are shallow scratches in the rock, offering little more than symbolic shelter. Others penetrate deep into the mountain's heart, creating chambers where darkness and silence reign in profound peace. It is toward one of these deeper sanctuaries that Elijah finds himself drawn, as if the cave itself calls out to him with the voice of ancient refuge. Perhaps this is the very cleft in the rock where Moses once hid when the glory of God passed by, where the great lawgiver was allowed to see the Almighty's back, but not his face, where divine goodness proclaimed itself in words that echoed from stone walls like thunder from a clear sky. The thought moves through Elijah's mind like a gentle current, connecting his present need with the holy history of this place, reminding him that he is not the first servant of God to seek shelter in the mountain's embrace. The cave welcomes him with cool shadows and blessed silence. After 40 days under the open sky, with the sun's relentless gaze and the wind's constant whisper, this enclosed space feels like a sanctuary prepared specifically for his arrival. The walls are smooth, polished by ages of wind and sand into curves that seem almost welcoming, almost maternal in their protective embrace. Here, in this womb of stone, Elijah settles into the deepest quiet he has known since leaving Jezreel. The silence is so complete it seems to have substance, wrapping around him like a thick blanket that muffles not only external sound, but also the frantic chatter of anxious thoughts that have plagued him for weeks. For the first time since Jezebel's threat arrived with the morning messenger, his mind grows still enough to hear the rhythm of his own heartbeat, the gentle whisper of his own breath. The darkness is profound, but not oppressive. This is not the darkness of despair that had surrounded him beneath the broom tree, but the restful darkness of deep caves and quiet chambers, the kind of darkness that invites rest and contemplation rather than fear. Here, without the distractions of sight, his other senses seem to awaken, attuning themselves to subtleties of sound and touch and presence that daylight often obscures. It is in this place of perfect stillness that the voice comes, not with the dramatic thunder that had marked God's presence on this mountain in Moses' time, but with a quietness that somehow fills the cave completely. The question arrives like morning light seeping slowly through shadows, gentle but inescapable. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The words carry no condemnation, no anger, only the kind of patient inquiry that a loving parent might offer to a child found hiding in a closet after a difficult day. Yet beneath their gentleness lies an invitation to honesty, a door opening toward conversation that has been waiting to happen since the prophet first began his flight from Jezreel. Elijah's response pours out like water from a broken dam, carrying with it all the frustration and loneliness and disappointed hope that has been building in his heart for months. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts," he begins, and the words echo from the cave walls with the bitter undertone of someone who feels that his zeal has been rewarded with abandonment. Listen as he recounts his story to the listening darkness, how the children of Israel have forsaken God's covenant, torn down the altars, killed the prophets with the sword. Each accusation carries the weight of personal betrayal, the pain of someone who has given everything for a people who seem determined to throw away the very gifts he has fought to preserve for them. "And I, even I only, am left," he continues, his voice breaking slightly on the word only. Here is the heart of his despair, the isolation that has driven him across hundreds of miles of wilderness to hide in this mountain cave. He feels utterly alone, the last faithful voice in a nation gone deaf to divine calling, the final prophet in a land that has chosen to kill its messengers rather than heed their words. And they seek my life to take it away. The sentence hangs in the cave's stillness like a physical presence, carrying all the fear and weariness and sense of futility that has brought him to this place of hiding. Jezebel's threat has become, in his mind, the final proof that even miraculous demonstrations of divine power cannot change human hearts that are determined to remain closed. The cave receives his complaint with patient silence, offering no immediate answers, no easy consolations. The stone walls have heard such words before, have sheltered other servants of God who felt abandoned and alone, who wondered if their sacrifice had been in vain, who questioned whether the divine love they proclaimed was real enough to sustain them through the darkest valleys of their calling. In this ancient sanctuary, carved from living rock by forces older than human memory, Elijah waits for whatever will come next. He has spoken his heart honestly, held nothing back, offered his bitterness and disappointment as frankly as he once offered his prayers for fire and rain. Now he sits in the encompassing darkness, feeling smaller than a grain of sand, yet somehow held by something larger than the mountain itself. The conversation has begun, though he doesn't yet understand its full implications. In this cave where Moses once encountered the passing glory of God, another prophet waits to discover that divine presence comes not always in expected forms, that the most profound revelations often arrive wrapped in the gentlest of packages, speaking in voices so quiet they can only be heard by hearts that have finally learned to be still. In the gentle darkness of the cave, after Elijah's words have settled into the stone silence like incense rising to heaven, the voice comes again. This time it carries a different quality. Not the tender inquiry of before, but something that feels like invitation mixed with instruction. Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. The words hang in the air with the weight of promise and mystery. Something is about to happen, something that requires Elijah to leave the safety of his stone sanctuary and expose himself to whatever manifestation of divine presence is approaching. There's both comfort and trembling in this command, for while it speaks of encounter with the divine, it also requires courage to step out of hiding and face whatever form that encounter might take. Picture Elijah as he rises slowly from his place of rest within the cave, his legs perhaps stiff from sitting so long in the mountain's embrace. His movements are careful, reverent, like someone entering a cathedral or approaching an altar. The darkness that had seemed so protective now feels somehow expectant, as if the very walls of the cave are holding their breath, waiting to witness what is about to unfold on the mountain's face. He moves toward the cave's mouth, where the entrance opens onto a narrow ledge carved into the mountain's side. The transition from the cave's gentle darkness to the outside light is gradual, his eyes slowly adjusting to the brightness of desert sky and weathered stone. The air outside carries a different quality now, charged with potential, humming with an energy that makes the hair on his arms stand upright and his heart begin to beat with anticipation. From his vantage point on the mountainside, Elijah can see for miles across the wilderness he has traversed, the rolling landscape of sand and stone stretching away toward horizons that shimmer in the heat. Below him, the mountain slopes fall away in dramatic sweeps and gentle curves, marked with the scars of ancient floods and the patient artistry of wind-carved rock. Then it begins. At first, there's only a stirring in the air, a subtle change in the way the morning breeze moves across the mountain's face. But within moments, that gentle stirring grows into something else entirely, something that transforms the very atmosphere around him. The wind begins to rise, not gradually as desert winds usually do, but with sudden, shocking force that seems to come from everywhere at once. This is not the playful breeze that dances through olive groves or the steady current that fills a merchant's sails. This is wind as elemental force, Wind as the raw power of creation unleashed. It strikes the mountain with the force of invisible hammers, howling through the rocky crevices with voices that sound almost human, almost desperate, as if the air itself is crying out in some ancient language of storm and fury. Watch as the wind tears at the mountain's face, pulling at loose stones and sending them cascading down the slopes in miniature avalanches. Trees that have clung to impossible perches for decades are uprooted in seconds, their gnarled branches snapping like twigs before being hurled into the air like offerings to some tempestuous god. The very rocks begin to crack under the pressure, great boulders splitting with sounds like thunder, their fragments spinning away into the storm-darkened sky. Elijah presses himself against the mountainside, his robes whipping around him like living things trying to escape the wind's fury. The force is so intense he can barely breathe, the air itself seeming to thin and thicken alternately as pressure waves sweep across the mountain's face. His hair streams behind him like a banner, and he has to close his eyes against the stinging particles of sand and stone that fill the air like a desert sandstorm multiplied beyond all reason. The sound is overwhelming, a constant roar that drowns out every other noise in creation. It's the sound of worlds being born or destroyed, of cosmic forces grinding against each other in celestial machinery too vast for human comprehension. The mountain itself seems to tremble under the assault, as if even these ancient foundations might not be able to withstand such concentrated power. Yet in the midst of this awesome display, in the center of this demonstration of raw divine might, Elijah's spirit somehow knows a profound truth that his mind is only beginning to grasp. For all its terrible majesty, for all its earth-shaking power, for all its ability to remake the landscape in moments, the Lord is not in the wind. This is not emptiness or absence, but a different kind of presence, a lesson being taught through contrast and comparison. The God who can command such forces, who can unleash the very breath of creation with hurricane intensity, who can split mountains and shatter stones with nothing more than moving air, chooses not to reveal himself through such dramatic displays. There's something almost tender in this recognition, something that speaks to a deeper understanding of divine character than Elijah has possessed before. The same God who had answered his prayer with fire from heaven, who had ended the drought with torrential rain, who had fed him through angelic hands in the wilderness, is now demonstrating that his true nature cannot be captured or contained by even the most spectacular exhibitions of power. As the wind finally begins to subside, its fury gradually lessening until it becomes once again a normal breeze moving across normal stone, Elijah remains pressed against the mountain, breathing heavily, his heart still racing from the encounter. The landscape around him has been transformed, littered with broken stones and uprooted vegetation, bearing the scars of forces that reshape the world according to their will. But the prophet's education is far from complete. This wind, mighty as it was, earth-shaking as its power proved to be, was only the first movement in a symphony of revelation that will teach him truths about the nature of divine presence that he has never imagined possible. In the settling dust and clearing air, he waits for whatever will come next, somehow understanding that he has witnessed only the beginning of a demonstration that will change everything he thought he knew about how heaven speaks to earth. As the last echoes of the great wind fade into the desert silence, Elijah finds himself in a landscape transformed, yet strangely expectant. The scattered stones and broken branches that litter the mountainside bear witness to the power that has just passed. But there's something in the quality of the stillness that follows, which speaks of more to come. The air itself seems to hold its breath, as if creation pauses between movements of some cosmic symphony whose final notes have yet to be played. The prophet remains pressed against the mountain's face, his hands still gripping the rough stone for stability, his heart gradually slowing from the rapid rhythm that the wind's fury had awakened. But even as his breathing begins to steady, he can feel something new building in the spiritual atmosphere around him, a different kind of tension that speaks not of wind and storm, but of forces that move deeper, that shake foundations rather than surfaces. Then it begins again, but this time from below rather than above, from the very bones of the earth, rather than the breath of the sky. At first it's just a tremor, so slight it might be dismissed as the settling of stones loosened by the wind. But within moments, that gentle vibration grows into something far more profound, something that speaks to the fundamental instability of what seems most solid and permanent in creation. The earthquake starts as a deep rumbling, felt more than heard, a bass note so low it seems to resonate in the very marrow of his bones. The mountain begins to sway beneath him like a ship on troubled waters, and Elijah must spread his arms wide against the rock face to keep from being thrown from his precarious perch. This is the earth remembering its ancient dance, the slow waltz of continental plates and tectonic forces that reshape the world according to rhythms too vast for human comprehension. Picture the awe and terror of feeling the mountain itself become unstable, of realizing that even these ancient foundations, which have stood sentinel over the desert for millennia, are subject to forces greater than themselves. The very ground that seems so dependable, so trustworthy beneath human feet, reveals itself to be merely a thin crust floating on an ocean of molten stone, held in place by delicate balances that can shift in an instant. The shaking intensifies, and with it comes the sound of the earth itself groaning under strain. Great boulders that have rested in their places since the world was young begin to roll and tumble down the mountainside with thunderous crashes. Crevices open in the rock face like wounds in living flesh, some barely wide enough for a man's hand, others yawning gaps that seem to reach toward the earth's molten heart. In this moment of terrestrial chaos, memory stirs in the prophet's mind. This is the same mountain where Moses once stood when the earth trembled beneath the weight of divine presence, where the children of Israel cowered in their tents as the very foundations of the world shook with the giving of the law. The earthquake that now grips Mount Horeb echoes that ancient demonstration of power, when God descended in fire and smoke and the mountain quaked greatly. The parallel is unmistakable, the connection profound. 8 centuries ago, in this very place, the earth had trembled as heaven touched earth to establish a covenant with a chosen people. Now it trembles again as another prophet learns lessons about the nature of divine presence that go deeper than law or covenant, that speak to the very heart of how the infinite chooses to reveal itself to the finite. As the earthquake reaches its crescendo, as the mountain groans and shifts around him like a living thing in pain, Elijah clings to the rock and marvels at the raw power of forces that can move mountains, that can reshape continents, that can shake the very pillars upon which the world rests. Yet even in the midst of this awesome display, his spirit somehow discerns the same truth that the wind had taught him. The Lord is not in the earthquake. Before the trembling has fully subsided, before the last stones have finished their tumbling descent, a new manifestation begins to build. This time it comes as light and heat as the flicker and dance of flames that seem to spring from the very air itself. Fire begins to appear along the mountain's face, not the wild conflagration of burning vegetation, but something far more mysterious. Tongues of flame that move according to no earthly wind, that burn without consuming, that illuminate without scorching. The fire spreads across the mountainside like liquid light, flowing around and over the rocky outcroppings with graceful movements that speak of intelligence, of purpose, of controlled power rather than random destruction. These flames carry the memory of other divine fires, the burning bush that Moses encountered in this same wilderness, the pillar of fire that led Israel through the darkness, the fire that fell from heaven at Elijah's own prayer on Mount Carmel. The heat is intense but not overwhelming, warming the air around the prophet until it shimmers like water, creating dancing mirages that transform the familiar landscape into something otherworldly, something that seems to exist halfway between earth and heaven. The light is brilliant but not blinding, casting everything in golden radiance that makes even the broken stones and scattered debris seem touched with glory. Yet again, as Elijah watches this spectacular display of divine power, as he feels the heat on his face and sees the flames dance across stone that should not burn, his heart receives the same quiet knowledge that has marked each manifestation. The Lord is not in the fire. 3 times now he has witnessed demonstrations of power that could remake the world, that could command the attention of nations, that could force recognition from the most stubborn hearts, wind that splits rocks, earthquake that shakes mountains, fire that burns without fuel, each one awesome in its own right, each one a legitimate expression of divine might, each one capable of inspiring fear and wonder and worship, but each one also lacking something essential, missing some quality that would mark it as the true dwelling place of divine presence. The God who commands these forces, who can unleash them with a thought and control them with a whisper, chooses not to reveal his essential nature through such overwhelming displays. As the fire begins to fade and the mountain settles into a new kind of stillness, Elijah senses that something is approaching, something different from wind or earthquake or flame, something that will complete this education in the nature of divine revelation and transform his understanding of how heaven chooses to speak to earth. As the last flames fade from the mountainside and the supernatural fire surrenders its hold on the ancient stones, a new kind of silence settles over Mount Horeb. This is not the empty quiet that follows exhaustion, nor the tense stillness that precedes another storm. This is silence pregnant with presence, rich with possibility, deep with the kind of peace that comes when all of creation holds its breath in anticipation of something sacred. Elijah remains pressed against the mountain's face, his body still trembling slightly from the successive waves of wind, earthquake, and fire that have swept across the rocky landscape. His mind struggles to process what he has witnessed, these magnificent demonstrations of power that have shaken the very foundations of earth and heaven. Yet beneath his awe runs a current of growing understanding, a sense that all of these displays have been preparation for something else, something that will make their absence of divine presence suddenly, perfectly clear. The silence deepens, becoming almost tangible, almost musical in its richness. It's the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the subtle sounds of life that usually disappear beneath the noise of daily existence. In this profound stillness, every small sound seems amplified, the whisper of his robe against stone, the soft intake of his breath, the distant call of a bird somewhere in the desert below. Then it comes, not with fanfare or announcement, not with the drama that had marked the wind and earthquake and fire, but with a gentleness so profound it almost escapes notice altogether. A voice. But calling it a voice seems inadequate, for this is something that speaks to places deeper than the ears, that touches regions of the soul where words become unnecessary, and communication happens in ways that transcend human language. The Hebrew phrase that will echo through history describes it as a still small voice. But even these words feel clumsy when trying to capture something so delicate, so intimate, so perfectly calibrated to the deepest needs of a human heart. It is the sound of silk sliding across silk, of morning mist settling on sleeping flowers, of love itself finding expression in the space between heartbeats. This voice carries no thunder, commands no earthquakes, lights no fires. Instead, it whispers with the tenderness of a mother speaking to her newborn child, with the intimacy of lovers sharing secrets in the darkness, with the gentle authority of wisdom that needs no shouting because it carries its own unshakable truth. It is the sound of divine love choosing to make itself small enough to fit inside a human heart without breaking it. As this gentle presence touches his awareness, Elijah feels something profound happen within his spirit. Every instinct trained by years of prophetic ministry, every expectation shaped by previous encounters with the divine, every assumption about how God reveals himself to his servants, suddenly shifts and realigns. This is not how he had expected to meet the Almighty on the mountain of God. This is infinitely more intimate, infinitely more personal, infinitely more transformative than anything he had imagined possible. Without conscious thought, his hands move to his cloak, drawing the simple fabric up to cover his face. This is not the gesture of someone hiding from wrath or seeking protection from overwhelming glory. This is the response of reverence so deep it becomes instinctive, the natural reaction of someone who suddenly understands that he is in the presence of mystery too sacred for casual observation. The cloak over his face creates a small, intimate space where the still, small voice can be heard more clearly, where the whisper can penetrate more deeply. In this self-created darkness, free from the distractions of sight, Elijah discovers that his other senses have become extraordinarily acute. He can feel the voice as much as hear it, can sense its presence like warmth spreading through his chest, like light growing brighter behind his closed eyelids. Slowly, carefully, as if approaching an altar or entering a holy of holies, Elijah moves toward the mouth of the cave. Each step is deliberate, reverent, taken with the awareness that he is crossing the threshold between ordinary space and sacred ground. The cave opening frames the desert landscape beyond, but now that familiar view seems transformed, touched with the same gentle presence that speaks in whispers rather than shouts. Standing at the cave's entrance, poised between the intimate darkness of his stone sanctuary and the vast openness of the desert beyond, Elijah positions himself to listen with every fibre of his being. His body is still, his breathing quiet, his heart open to receive whatever words this gentle voice might speak. He has learned, in this moment of perfect stillness, that some truths can only be heard when everything else falls silent. This is the revolutionary moment when power chooses gentleness, when the God who commands winds and earthquakes and fires reveals that his essential nature is found not in force but in tenderness, not in overwhelming might but in intimate love. The same divine will that can split mountains and light the sky chooses instead to whisper, to come close, to speak in tones so soft they require the listener to lean in, to pay attention, to participate in the conversation through the very act of careful listening. In this convergence of infinite power and infinite gentleness, Elijah discovers something that will change not only his understanding of God, but his entire approach to ministry, to prayer, to life itself. The still small voice represents a kind of divine presence that doesn't demand attention but invites it, that doesn't force recognition but welcomes it, that speaks most clearly to those who have learned to create space for whispers in their hearts. Here, on this ancient mountain where heaven and earth have met in thunder and flame, where the law was given amid smoke and earthquake, the ultimate revelation comes not as cosmic drama, but as intimate conversation, not as public demonstration, but as personal encounter, not as the voice of a distant deity, but as the whisper of love itself, drawing near to comfort a wounded servant who had forgotten that he was first and always a beloved child. In the sacred space created by the still small voice, where the mountain air itself seems to shimmer with gentle presence, the same question comes again that had first drawn Elijah from his cave's darkness. But now it carries a different quality, spoken not from the distant thunder of divine authority, but from the intimate closeness of love that has drawn near enough to whisper. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The words drift across the space between heaven and earth like morning dew settling on thirsty ground, each syllable carrying the patient tenderness of a shepherd calling to a lost sheep, of a father speaking to a prodigal son who has wandered far from home. There is no condemnation in the question, no impatience with the prophet's flight or frustration with his fears. Instead, there is simply the invitation to conversation, to honest dialogue between the infinite and the finite, between the Creator and his beloved creature, standing at the mouth of the cave with his face still covered in reverent acknowledgement of the sacred encounter. Elijah finds that the same words flow from his heart as before, but now they are spoken into a presence that receives them with perfect understanding, perfect compassion. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts," he begins, his voice barely above a whisper, matching the gentle tone that has transformed the mountain into a sanctuary of intimate communication. The complaint spills out again, But now it feels less like accusation and more like the honest sharing of a wounded heart that finally has found safe space to speak its pain. The broken covenant, the thrown-down altars, the murdered prophets, his own isolation and fear, all pour out in words that carry not anger but grief, not rebellion but the deep sadness of someone who has given everything for a cause that seems lost. And I, even I only, am left, he continues. And these words of ultimate loneliness hang in the still air like a prayer for comfort, like a cry for reassurance that his life and ministry have not been meaningless, that his faithfulness has not gone unnoticed, that he is not as alone as his circumstances have made him feel. The response, when it comes, arrives wrapped in the same gentle whisper that has marked this entire encounter, but it carries within its softness a power to heal that all the wind and earthquake and fire could not provide. It begins not with rebuke for his self-pity or correction of his theology, but with practical instructions that speak to his need for renewed purpose, for restored hope, for a future that extends beyond his current despair. Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, the voice instructs, with the calm authority of love that knows exactly what its beloved needs to hear. These are not the words of a disappointed master sending away a failed servant, but the gentle guidance of wisdom pointing a confused child toward the path that leads home. The instructions that follow unfold like a map of hope drawn across the landscape of Elijah's future. He is to anoint Hazael as king over Syria, a task that will place him at the center of international politics, that will make him a kingmaker rather than simply a prophet fleeing from queens. He is to anoint Jehu as king over Israel, a commission that speaks to God's ongoing concern for his chosen people, his determination to establish leaders who will serve justice rather than their own appetites. But perhaps most significantly, he is to anoint Elisha the son of Shaphat as prophet in his place, a command that addresses his deepest fear about being alone, about being the last faithful voice in a faithless generation. Here is the divine promise that his ministry will continue, that his calling will not die with him, that there will be others to carry the torch of truth when his own strength finally fails. Then comes the revelation that transforms everything Elijah thought he knew about his situation, the truth that reframes his entire understanding of faithfulness and failure, of isolation and community. Yet I have left me 7,000 in Israel, the gentle voice continues, each word falling like drops of healing oil on a wounded spirit. All the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which has not kissed him. 7,000, not just a handful of secret believers hiding in caves and corners, but 7,000 faithful hearts scattered throughout the land, quietly maintaining their devotion to the true God despite the pressure to conform, despite the risk of persecution, despite the apparent triumph of false worship. 7,000 people who have not seen dramatic miracles or heard prophetic voices, who have simply chosen to remain faithful in the ordinary darkness of daily life. This number speaks to the profound mystery of divine faithfulness, to God's ability to preserve and protect even when his servants cannot see the evidence of his work. While Elijah had been focused on the public failures, the dramatic apostasies, the visible signs of spiritual decay, the quiet work of grace had been continuing in thousands of hidden hearts, maintaining the flame of true worship in circumstances that seemed designed to extinguish it completely. The conversation in whispers has accomplished what all the supernatural demonstrations could not. It has restored Elijah's sense of purpose, renewed his understanding of his place in God's larger plan, and most importantly, healed the crushing loneliness that had driven him to this mountain sanctuary. He is not alone. He has never been alone. The faithful community he thought had disappeared entirely has been there all along, invisible but real, silent but steadfast. As this gentle revelation settles into his heart like water soaking into drought-stricken ground, Elijah feels something that has been missing since Jezebel's threat first reached his ears: hope. Not the dramatic hope of miraculous intervention or supernatural rescue, but the quieter, deeper hope that comes from understanding that he is part of something larger than his own ministry, connected to a community of faith that spans generations and crosses every boundary. The still small voice has spoken truths that reshape his entire world, that transform his understanding of success and failure, that restore his place in the ongoing story of divine love pursuing human hearts through all the complexities of history and circumstance. The journey down from Mount Horeb is nothing like the frantic flight that had brought Elijah to its sacred heights, where his feet had once stumbled in panic across the desert stones. Now they move with quiet certainty, carrying a man transformed not by dramatic miracles but by intimate conversation, not by overwhelming power but by gentle whispers that have restored his understanding of divine love and purpose. Each step away from the mountain carries him back toward the world of human community, toward the 7,000 faithful hearts he now knows are scattered throughout Israel like hidden stars in a clouded sky. The landscape through which he travels is the same wilderness of sand and stone, the same ancient paths carved by wind and water, but everything seems different when viewed through eyes that have learned to see hope in whispers rather than only in thunder. The prophet's pace is unhurried but purposeful, no longer driven by fear but drawn by assignment, no longer fleeing from an angry queen but walking toward the fulfillment of divine commission. In his travel pouch, alongside the simple provisions for the journey, he carries something invisible but precious. The knowledge that his story is not ending but entering a new chapter, that his ministry will continue not through his own strength but through the faithful succession that God himself has planned. Days pass in steady walking, the rhythm of footsteps creating a meditative cadence that allows his heart to fully absorb the lessons learned in the mountain's embrace. The still small voice has not fallen silent with distance. Instead, it has taken up residence within his spirit, providing a constant undercurrent of peace beneath all his thoughts and decisions. He finds himself listening differently now, attuned to subtleties of divine guidance that he had missed during his years of seeking God primarily in the spectacular. When he finally crosses from the wilderness back into the settled lands of Israel, the transition feels like awakening from a profound dream. Here are the fields and villages, the olive groves and vineyards, the busy intersections of human life that he had fled from in terror. But now they appear not as places of danger, but as communities where those 7,000 faithful hearts maintain their quiet devotion, where the work of the kingdom continues in ways both seen and unseen. It is in the territory of Issachar, in the broad valley where farmers work their inherited fields, that Elijah finds the man whose name the still small voice had whispered on the mountain. Elisha, son of Shaphat, is ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen, working the rich soil that will feed families throughout the coming year. Picture this scene, a young man bent to the ancient task of agriculture, his hands calloused from honest labour, his face bronzed by seasons of working under the open sky, entirely unaware that his life is about to change forever. There's something beautiful about this moment of calling, this intersection of the ordinary and the extraordinary. Elisha is not praying for visions or seeking prophetic ministry. He is simply doing the work that life has given him, faithfully tending the land that has been entrusted to his care. Yet it is precisely in this context of faithful ordinariness that the divine summons finds him, demonstrating again the truth that God's presence dwells as much in ploughed fields as in mountain caves. Elijah approaches without fanfare, without dramatic announcement. He simply walks to where the young farmer works and, in a gesture both simple and profound, removes his mantle and casts it upon Elisha's shoulders. The hairy cloak that has sheltered the prophet through years of ministry, that has absorbed the dust of countless journeys and the spray of many tears, now settles around another set of shoulders like a blessing made tangible. This passing of the mantle is more than symbolic. It is sacramental, a physical sign of spiritual reality, a tangible transfer of calling and authority. The cloak carries with it the scent of desert winds and mountain air, the weight of prayers offered in solitude and tears shed in caves. the texture of a life lived in intimate conversation with the divine. When it settles around Elisha's shoulders, it brings with it not just the responsibility of prophetic ministry, but also the promise of divine presence that has sustained every true servant throughout history. Elisha's response reveals the depth of understanding that sometimes comes in moments of profound calling. He doesn't question the gesture or demand explanations. Instead, he asks only for permission to bid farewell to his parents, to honor the relationships that have shaped him before stepping into the unknown future that beckons. It's a request that speaks to character, to the kind of heart that values faithfulness in small things as preparation for faithfulness in large ones. When Elisha returns from his farewells, he demonstrates the completeness of his commitment through actions more powerful than words. He takes the wooden yoke that has guided his oxen through countless days of ploughing and burns it as fuel to cook the oxen themselves, creating a feast for the people of his village. It's a gesture of finality, a burning of bridges, a declaration that he is stepping fully into his new calling without reservation or plans for retreat. The feast itself becomes a celebration of transition, a community acknowledgement that one of their own has been called to serve a purpose larger than local farming, a recognition that the kingdom of God sometimes requires servants to leave familiar furrows for paths that lead into mystery. As the villagers share the meat and bread, they participate unknowingly in a moment that will echo through generations, a passing of torches that will keep the flame of prophetic ministry burning through the darkest seasons ahead. As Elisha arises from that feast and begins to follow Elijah, becoming his servant and student, the older prophet feels something settle in his heart that has been missing since his flight from Jezreel began. This is what the still small voice had promised. Not just personal comfort, but purposeful continuation. Not just private healing, but public ministry. Not just individual restoration, but community blessing. The man who had run from his calling in terror now walks confidently toward its fulfillment, carrying with him the peace that comes from understanding that God's purposes are larger than human failures. That divine faithfulness transcends mortal weakness. That the kingdom advances not through perfect servants, but through surrendered hearts willing to listen for whispers in the wind. As the ancient story of Elijah draws to its gentle close, the lessons learned on Mount Horeb continue to echo across the centuries, like ripples spreading from a stone dropped into still water. The prophet's encounter with the still small voice has become more than historical event. It has become invitation, more than ancient narrative. It has become eternal truth about the nature of divine presence and the art of spiritual listening. In our own time, separated from Elijah's mountain experience by thousands of years, yet connected to it by the unchanging human heart, we find ourselves facing the same essential choice that confronted the weary prophet in his cave of stone. We can seek God in the dramatic demonstrations of power that capture attention and demand recognition, or we can learn to attune our spirits to the gentle whispers that speak most clearly in moments of surrendered stillness. Picture yourself in the landscape of your own daily life, surrounded by the noise and urgency that characterize our modern world, the constant hum of technology, the relentless pace of digital communication, the overwhelming flood of information and stimulation that fills every available moment of consciousness. In such an environment, the still small voice that spoke to Elijah might seem impossibly faint, easily drowned out by the cacophony of contemporary existence. Yet the truth that emerged from that ancient mountain remains as relevant today as it was 3 millennia ago. The divine presence that chose whispers over wind, intimacy over earthquake, tenderness over fire, continues to speak in the same gentle tones to hearts that have learned to create space for listening. The God who revealed himself to Elijah in quiet conversation still prefers the sanctuary of surrendered souls to the theatre of public spectacle. Consider how often we, like the prophet before his mountain experience, expect divine encounter to arrive with unmistakable drama. We look for burning bushes in our ordinary gardens, for parted seas in our daily challenges, for fire from heaven to resolve our earthly conflicts. We pray for miracles loud enough to silence every doubt, signs dramatic enough to compel belief. interventions spectacular enough to solve every problem without requiring the patient work of faith. But Elijah's education on Mount Horeb suggests a different approach to spiritual awareness, a more subtle art of recognition that finds sacred presence in places we might otherwise overlook. The still small voice speaks not in the crashing of waves, but in the gentle lapping of water against shore, not in the roar of forest fires, but in the whisper of wind through leaves, not in the thunder of storms, but in the soft patter of rain on windows. Learning to listen for this gentler frequency of divine communication requires what contemplatives throughout history have called the practice of stillness. This is not the passive quiet of empty minds, but the active receptivity of hearts prepared to receive whispers, of spirits disciplined enough to distinguish between the noise of anxiety and the music of grace, of souls spacious enough to welcome mystery without demanding immediate explanation. In our bedrooms at night, when the day's demands finally release their grip and consciousness begins its gentle descent towards sleep, we often find ourselves most receptive to this quieter wavelength of spiritual reality. Here, in the sanctuary of darkened rooms and slowing breath, the still small voice that spoke to Elijah continues its patient ministry to every generation, offering comfort to the weary, guidance to the confused, hope to the discouraged. The whisper that healed the prophet's isolation with news of 7,000 faithful hearts continues to speak the same truth to every person who feels alone in their commitment to goodness, alone in their pursuit of justice, alone in their hunger for meaning deeper than material success. You are not alone. The community of faithful hearts spans every generation, crosses every boundary, includes every sincere seeker who has ever listened for love's voice in the spaces between heartbeats. As you lie in the gentle darkness of your own rest, perhaps you can sense something of what Elijah discovered in his mountain cave. The presence that moves through your breathing, that speaks in the rhythm of your heartbeat, that whispers peace into the anxious corners of your mind. This is not the distant deity of theological argument, but the intimate companion who meets you in the vulnerable spaces of honest prayer, in the quiet moments of grateful recognition, in the gentle surrendering that happens when strength finally admits its limitations. The mountain where Elijah learned to listen remains accessible to every soul willing to make the journey from noise to silence, from striving to stillness, from demanding answers to receiving presence. This mountain exists not only in the geography of ancient Sinai, but in the interior landscape of every human heart that has learned to be quiet long enough to hear whispers. Tonight, as sleep approaches like a gentle tide carrying away the debris of daily concern, you are invited into the same conversation that transformed a frightened prophet into a man of quiet confidence. The still, small voice that spoke comfort in a desert cave continues to speak the same words of healing. You are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are not beyond the reach of love that moves mountains through whispers rather than earthquakes. In the morning, when consciousness returns and the day's responsibilities call you back to the world of noise and urgency, you can carry with you the peace that comes from this nighttime listening. This gentle encounter with presence that speaks most clearly when everything else finally falls silent. The still, small voice that changed Elijah's understanding of divine nature continues to offer the same gift to every generation. The radical discovery that ultimate power chooses to express itself through infinite tenderness, that the God who commands galaxies prefers to communicate through whispers soft enough to be heard only by hearts that have learned the sacred art of being still. Rest now in this knowledge, sleep peacefully in this presence, and let the still small voice that spoke to a prophet on an ancient mountain speak its gentle truths into the quiet depths of your own listening heart. The conversation continues, the whisper endures, and love finds its way into every soul courageous enough to choose silence over noise, stillness over striving, listening over speaking.